Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to look at quadratic equations. You may recall that we learned how to solve quadratic equations using factoring. For example, supposing I wanted to solve this quadratic equation. Remember, a quadratic equation has the highest power as 2 on the variable. So if I want to solve 2x squared minus 3x equals 9, the first thing I would want to do if I'm going to use factoring is I move the 9 to the other side. In other words, I subtract 9 from both sides and I get 2x squared minus 3x minus 9 equals 0. And then we could factor the left side. So if we factor the left side, we get 2x plus 3 times x minus 3. You have to verify the factors of 2x squared are 2x and x. The factors of negative 9 that will give you the negative 3 would be plus 3 and negative 3. And when you FOIL this out, you get a negative 3x in the middle. So you'd have to verify that this is the correct factoring. So remember, once we factored the quadratic equation on the left side, we set each factor equal to 0 because of the zero factor property, which says that if we have two factors or more multiplied to give us 0, either one of those factors could be 0. So therefore, we have 2x plus 3 is 0, or x minus 3 is 0 from the zero factor property. And that tells us if we solve each of these equations, which are now linear equations, if we solve each of these equations for x, we get x equals, from the top, we subtract 3 and then divide by 2, so we get negative 3 halves. So that could be one solution. And if we add 3 to both sides from the second equation here, we get x equals 3. So those are my two solutions by factoring. Let's take another example. Here we have an equation, a quadratic equation, x squared minus 4 equals 0. Now we're going to solve this by factoring. So you may recognize that x squared minus 4 is a difference of 2 squared. We have x squared and we have subtract 2 squared because 4 is actually 2 squared. And you may recall that when you factor the difference of 2 squares, it factors into a sum and a difference. In other words, x squared minus 4 will factor into x minus 2 times x plus 2. So we have the equation now, x minus 2 times x plus 2 equals 0. And using the zero factor property, we set each of these factors equal to 0 to get either x minus 2 is 0 or x plus 2 is 0. And solving each of these linear equations for x, we end up with the solution x equals 2 or x equals negative 2. So there's the solution to this quadratic equation. Now, in this particular situation, there is another way to solve this quadratic equation without factoring. And that method is called solving quadratic equations using the root property. So the square root property tells us that if x squared is equal to a, and a is positive, greater than or equal to 0, then x equals the square root of a, the positive square root of a, or x equals the negative square root of a. Well, how does this help us solve a quadratic equation? Well, let's recall our last example, x squared minus 4 equal to 0. Well, using the root property, what I'm going to do in this case is now isolate the x squared. So I want x squared on one side and everything else on the other side. So what I have to do is add 4 to both sides for this particular equation to get x squared equal to 4. Now we have, it says here, if x squared equals a, and a is positive, so in this case our a is 4, then x is the square root of a, or the negative square root of a. So what is the square root of 4? The square root of 4 is 2. So from the square root property, we can say that x is equal to 2, or x is equal to negative 2, because 2 is the positive square root of 4, and negative 2 is the negative square root of 4. And so the square root property allows us to solve these types of equations. Let's take another example. In this case, we want to solve 2x squared equal to 7, and we're going to use the square root property. So we want x squared by itself. So the first thing you want to do is divide both sides by 2. And then so we end up with x squared equals 7 halves. And the square root property tells us that we need just square root both sides, and we get the positive root and the negative root on the right side. So in other words, x is going to be equal to the square root of 7/2 or the negative square root of 7/2. Now, from our study of roots, you may see that this is actually an irrational number in the denominator. This is the square root of 7 over the square root of 2. And so sometimes in your answer, you want to rationalize the denominator. How would I rationalize the denominator in this case? Well, since the square root of 2 is in the denominator, we multiply both top and bottom by the square root of 2. And what we get is root 7 times root 2 on the top. So we have a root 7 times root 2. That will give me a square root of 14, because you multiply the numbers in the root. And then square root of 2 times square root of 2. Just let's do this one. Square root of 2 times square root of 2 is the square root of 4. But the square root of 4 is what? 2. So really this is the square root of 14 over 2. And similarly on the other answer, the negative answer, we're going to get negative the square root of 14 over 2. So these are our two solutions to that quadratic equation. And we found these by using the square root property.